It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the suburbs of Boston. Dr. Sarah Thompson had just finished a long and difficult heart surgery at Memorial Hospital. She was tired but satisfied, knowing she had saved another life. The clock on her car dashboard showed 8:45 p.m. as she drove her black Mercedes through the peaceful streets of Oak Hill, an upscale neighborhood where many doctors and lawyers lived. Sarah had worked hard for everything she owned. Growing up in a middle-class family in Detroit, she had earned scholarships to attend medical school and spent years building her reputation as one of the best cardiac surgeons in the state. At 38 years old, she had already performed over 1,000 successful surgeries and saved countless lives. The autumn air was cool, and street lights cast long shadows on the road. Sarah was thinking about her next day's schedule when she noticed the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She checked her speed, 35 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Her heart sank a little, but she wasn't worried. She had done nothing wrong. Following proper procedure, Sarah turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over to the right side of the empty street. Through her mirror, she could see two police officers stepping out of their patrol car. One was tall and heavy-set, while the other was shorter with broad shoulders. Their hands were already resting on their gun holsters. This is strange, Sarah thought to herself, maintaining her calm. She had been in situations like this before and knew exactly what to do. The certificate of appreciation from the mayor's office for saving his wife's life hung on her office wall, but out here, in the dark, she was just another black woman in an expensive car. The taller officer, whose nameplate read Reynolds, approached her window with an aggressive stance. His partner, Officer Barrett, stood slightly behind, his hand still on his weapon. The flashlight beam hit Sarah's face harshly, making her squint. "License and registration," Officer Reynolds barked, not even bothering to say good evening. His tone was filled with suspicion and barely hidden hostility. "Good evening, officer," Sarah replied politely, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "My license is in my purse on the passenger seat, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." "Just hurry up," Reynolds snapped, while Barrett watched her every move like a hawk. As Sarah carefully reached for her documents, she noticed Reynolds examining her car with obvious skepticism. She could almost read his thoughts. What was someone like her doing in this neighborhood, driving this kind of car? "This vehicle was reported in a drug trafficking case," Barrett suddenly announced, though Sarah knew this was a lie. Her car was only 3 months old, and she had bought it directly from the Mercedes dealership. "There must be some mistake," Sarah said calmly, handing over her license and registration. "I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson, a cardiac surgeon at Memorial Hospital. I'm just heading home after performing emergency surgery." Reynolds snorted, clearly not believing her. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Sarah's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. Years of performing complex surgeries had taught her to stay composed under pressure. She knew what was coming: the unnecessary search, the degrading questions, the thinly veiled racism wrapped in official procedure. As she carefully stepped out of her car, Sarah noticed more patrol cars approaching in the distance. What should have been a simple traffic stop, if it was even that, was quickly turning into something much more serious. The cool evening air felt heavy with tension, and nearby house lights began turning on as curious neighbors peeked through their windows. Little did Officers Reynolds and Barrett know that their actions in the next few minutes would not only change their lives forever, but would also spark a conversation that their entire department needed to have. For now, though, they were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers, targeting a woman who had probably saved more lives in the past month than they had in their entire careers. The night was about to take an unexpected turn, and none of them were prepared for what would happen next. Officer Reynolds circled Sarah's Mercedes like a predator, his flashlight beam scanning every inch of the expensive car. The autumn wind had picked up, making the trees rustle and creating an eerie atmosphere on the quiet suburban street. Sarah stood patiently by her car, her doctor's coat still on, her hospital ID badge clearly visible around her neck. "So, doctor," Reynolds said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "mind explaining how someone like you can afford a car like this?" He tapped the hood of the Mercedes with his flashlight, making Sarah wince at the disrespect to her property. Officer Barrett was now checking her trunk, though he had no warrant or probable cause. More police cars had arrived, their lights painting the peaceful neighborhood in alternating red and blue. Neighbors were now openly watching from their porches and windows, some recording with their phones. "I've been a cardiac surgeon at Memorial Hospital for the past 10 years, Sarah explained calmly, though her heart was racing. "You can call the hospital to verify my position. I just finished performing emergency surgery on a 7-year-old boy." Reynolds laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the night air. "Right. And I suppose you just happened to be driving through this nice neighborhood by accident." He picked up his radio. "Dispatch, run a check on this license. Looking for any outstanding warrants or drug-related offenses." Sarah felt her anger rising, but years of dealing with high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her to stay composed. She reached slowly into her coat pocket, making both officers tense up immediately. "Don't move," Barrett shouted, his hand back on his weapon. "I'm just getting my phone," Sarah said steadily, keeping her movements slow. "I can call Dr. Williams, the chief of surgery. He can confirm who I am." "Put your hands where we can see them," Reynolds barked, taking an aggressive step forward. "We'll do our own verification." More neighbors had gathered now, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Anderson, an elderly white woman from across the street, stepped forward. "Officers, I know Dr. Thompson. She's telling the truth. She saved countless lives at Memorial." "Ma'am, please stay back," Barrett cut her off. "This is police business." The situation was getting out of hand. Sarah could see at least 4 patrol cars now, their lights illuminating the street like a carnival gone wrong. One of the new officers was going through her medical bag, carelessly dumping out expensive surgical tools onto the hood of her car. "Those are sterile medical instruments," Sarah protested, her professional concern overriding her fear. "They need to be handled carefully." "Quiet," Reynolds snapped. "If you're really a doctor, you can explain why our drug dogs are so interested in your vehicle." Sarah looked around in confusion. There weren't any police dogs in sight. The lie was so obvious it would have been funny if the situation wasn't so serious. She noticed some of the neighbors shaking their heads in disgust at the officer's behavior. Just then, Sarah's phone started ringing in her pocket. The sound made everyone jump. It was her special ringtone for emergency hospital calls. She knew what that meant. Somewhere, someone needed urgent cardiac care. "That's the hospital emergency line," she said firmly. "Someone might be dying. I need to take this call." "Sure it is," Reynolds sneered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The phone kept ringing insistently. Officer Barrett was now looking uncomfortable. He noticed Sarah's hospital ID badge and the way she carried herself. Something wasn't adding up with their assumptions. The radio on Reynolds' shoulder crackled to life. "Dispatch to Unit 47, a female voice said urgently. Is Dr. Sarah Thompson with you? We have an emergency call from Memorial Hospital. They need their chief cardiac surgeon immediately for a critical case." The atmosphere changed instantly. Reynolds' face went pale as he looked at Sarah again, really seeing her for the first time. Barrett stepped back, lowering his hand from his weapon. But before anyone could speak, another police car came screeching around the corner, and out stepped Sergeant Miller. He took one look at Sarah and his eyes went wide with recognition. The night was about to take an even more dramatic turn, and the truth that would emerge would shake these officers to their core. Sergeant Miller rushed forward, his face showing both shock and embarrassment. "Dr. Thompson? What in God's name is going on here?" he asked, looking angrily at his officers. The surgeon's hand was unconsciously touching his chest, where a long surgical scar lay hidden under his uniform. 3 months ago, Sarah had performed emergency heart surgery on Sergeant Miller after he had a massive heart attack during his daughter's wedding. She had worked for 6 hours straight to save his life. Now, here he was, watching his own officers harassing the woman who had given him a second chance at life. "Your officers seem to think I'm a drug dealer," Sarah said calmly, still standing straight and professional despite the chaos around her. "They've been searching my car without cause and refusing to verify my identity." Reynolds and Barrett looked like they wanted to disappear into the ground. Their faces had turned pale as they watched their sergeant interact with Sarah. The phone in Sarah's pocket was still ringing urgently. "For heaven's sake, let her answer the phone," Sergeant Miller shouted. "That's the emergency line from Memorial. I recognize that ringtone from my time in the hospital." Sarah quickly answered the call, turning away from the officers to speak professionally. Dr. Thompson here. Yes, yes, I understand. Tell them to prep the ore immediately. I'm on my way. She ended the call and turned back to face the group. There's a 9-year-old girl who needs immediate cardiac surgery, she announced. Her heart is failing, and I'm the only surgeon in the area qualified to perform this particular procedure. So, officers, you need to decide right now. Are you going to continue harassing me, or are you going to let me go save a child's life? The neighbors who had been watching started murmuring angrily. Mrs. Anderson stepped forward again, this time more forcefully. I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never seen such shameful behavior from our police. Dr. Thompson saved my grandson last year. She's a hero in this community. Sergeant Miller turned to his officers, his face red with anger. Reynolds, Barrett, you've really done it this time. Do you have any idea who Dr. Thompson is? She's not just any surgeon. She's the person who saved my life 3 months ago. The person who made it possible for me to walk my daughter down the aisle. Reynolds tried to speak, but no words came out. Barrett was staring at his shoes, his earlier confidence completely gone. The other officers had started packing up their equipment, trying to disappear from the embarrassing scene as quickly as possible. We didn't know, Reynolds finally managed to say. Of course you didn't know, Sarah replied, gathering her scattered medical instruments. You didn't bother to check. You saw my skin color and made assumptions. But right now, there's a little girl who needs my help, and every minute we waste here decreases her chances of survival. Sergeant Miller immediately took charge. Johnson, he called to one of the other officers. Give Dr. Thompson a police escort to Memorial. Lights and sirens all the way. Make sure she gets there as fast as possible. As Sarah got back into her Mercedes, Sergeant Miller approached her window. Dr. Thompson, I can't begin to apologize for what happened here. This isn't over. There will be consequences for this behavior. Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. You're right, Sergeant. This isn't over. But not for the reasons you think. We need to talk about making real changes in your department. But first, I have a life to save. With that, Sarah started her car. Officer Johnson's patrol car pulled in front of her, sirens blaring. As she drove away, she could see Reynolds and Barrett in her rearview mirror, still standing frozen on the street, their world turned upside down. The night wasn't over yet. There was still a surgery to perform, a life to save, and later, some important conversations to have about change. But for now, Sarah focused on what she did best, being a healer, regardless of who needed healing. Sarah raced through the empty streets of Boston, following Officer Johnson's patrol car as it cleared the way with its flashing lights and sirens. Her mind was already shifting from the terrible encounter with the police to the emergency that awaited her at Memorial Hospital. Years of experience had taught her how to push aside personal troubles when a patient needed her. The emergency room entrance was crowded when she arrived. Dr. Williams, the chief of surgery, was waiting outside with a worried look on his face. As Sarah parked her car, she noticed Officer Johnson watching with a mix of awe and shame as the entire medical team rushed to greet her. Dr. Thompson, thank God you're here, Dr. Williams said, already walking with her towards the building. The patient is Emily Parker, 9 years old. Her heart condition has suddenly worsened. He paused, looking confused at the police escort. Why did you have a police car with you? That's a story for later, Sarah replied, putting on her surgical coat. Tell me more about Emily. As they hurried through the hospital corridors, nurses and doctors quickly moved aside, respecting the urgency of their mission. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the white walls as Dr. Williams explained the situation. Emily was born with a rare heart defect. She's been on the transplant list, but her heart started failing faster than expected. Her parents are here. They're terrified. He handed Sarah the medical charts. The father, well, you should know something about him. They stopped outside the preparation room. What about him? Sarah asked, already reviewing the child's vital signs on the charts. It's Officer Reynolds, the same officer who's been causing trouble in the community lately. Emily is his daughter. Sarah's hands froze on the medical chart. Officer Reynolds, the same man who had just finished harassing her on the street, who had assumed she was a criminal, was the father of the little girl who needed her help. Through the window, she could see Reynolds and his wife in the waiting room. He was still in his police uniform, having rushed straight from the street confrontation. He hadn't seen her yet. His wife was crying, and he looked broken, not the aggressive officer from earlier, but a scared father about to lose his child. He doesn't know you're the surgeon on call, does he? Dr. Williams asked quietly. No, Sarah replied, taking a deep breath. He doesn't. The monitors in Emily's room started beeping more urgently. There was no more time for discussion. Sarah entered the preparation room, where nurses were already getting surgical tools ready. Through the observation window, she saw Reynolds finally notice her. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, shame, fear, and then desperate hope. Sarah walked into the waiting room. Reynolds immediately stood up, his eyes filled with tears. Dr. Thompson, he said, his voice shaking. What I did earlier. Officer Reynolds. Sarah cut him off professionally. Right now, I'm not interested in what happened on Oak Hill Street. I'm here as Emily's surgeon, and I need you to focus on being her father. Can you do that? Reynolds nodded, unable to speak. His wife looked confused at the tension between them. Your daughter has a difficult heart condition, but I specialize in exactly this type of case, Sarah explained, her voice gentle but confident. I'm going to do everything in my power to help her. Do I have your permission to operate? Yes, please, Reynolds whispered. Please save our daughter. As Sarah turned to leave, Reynolds grabbed her hand. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. After what I did, why would you help us? Sarah looked at him steadily. Because that's who I am, Officer Reynolds. That's who I've always been, even when you couldn't see it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a life to save. She walked away, leaving Reynolds standing there, understanding for the first time the true measure of the woman he had judged so wrongly. The operating room was waiting, and Sarah had more important things to focus on than the irony of the situation. A child's life hung in the balance, and that was all that mattered now. The operating room was cold and bright, just the way Sarah liked it. She stood at the washing station, methodically scrubbing her hands and arms, a ritual she had performed thousands of times before. But this time felt different. Through the window, she could see Emily's small body on the operating table, already prepared for surgery. Nurse Jenkins, who had worked with Sarah for 8 years, noticed something was wrong. Dr. Thompson, you seem tense. Is everything okay? She asked while helping Sarah into her surgical gown. Just a complicated evening, Marie, Sarah replied, pulling on her gloves with practiced precision. But right now, all that matters is Emily. The operating room was filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the quiet efficiency of the surgical team. Dr. Williams stood ready to assist, watching Sarah carefully. He knew her well enough to sense that something unusual had happened, but also knew better than to ask questions before a major surgery. Scalpel, Sarah said calmly, and a familiar dance began. As she made the first incision, her mind cleared of everything except the task at hand. The confrontation with Officer Reynolds, the racial profiling, the humiliation, all of it faded away. There was only the surgery, only Emily's failing heart that needed her help. 3 hours into the procedure, things got critical. Emily's heart readings started to drop dangerously. The monitoring machines filled the room with urgent beeping. BP dropping, called out the anesthesiologist. We're losing her. Sarah's hands remained steady, even as sweat formed on her forehead. Not today, she whispered. Not on my watch. She had performed this procedure many times before, but Emily's small heart presented unique challenges. Outside in the waiting room, Officer Reynolds paced nervously, still in his uniform from earlier. His wife sat praying quietly, holding Emily's favorite teddy bear. Other officers had started gathering too. Barrett was there, along with Sergeant Miller, all of them waiting anxiously for news. Back in the operating room, Sarah worked with intense focus. More suction, she commanded. Light closer, please. Every movement was precise, every decision crucial. The next 30 minutes would determine everything. Dr. Williams watched in amazement as Sarah attempted a complicated technique she had developed herself, one that had saved dozens of children over the years. Her hands moved with incredible skill, making corrections that few other surgeons would even attempt. Come on, Emily, Sarah murmured as she worked. Your parents are waiting for you. You have so much life ahead of you. Finally, after 5 intense hours of surgery, the monitors showed strong, steady heartbeats. The room collectively breathed a sigh of relief. Sarah stepped back, nodding to her team. "We did it," she said quietly. "Good work, everyone." As the nurses began post-operative procedures, Sarah walked to the scrub room and slowly removed her surgical mask. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing the fatigue in her eyes. It had been a long day, from her morning surgeries to the police confrontation, and now this emergency operation. Dr. Williams followed her. "That was incredible, Sarah, the technique you used. I've never seen anything like it. That child is alive because of your skill." Sarah washed her hands slowly, thinking about what she would say to Reynolds and his wife. How do you face parents who just hours ago had treated you like a criminal and tell them you've saved their child's life? "Would you like me to talk to the parents?" Dr. Williams offered, sensing her hesitation. "No," Sarah replied, straightening her back. "This is something I need to do myself." As she walked toward the waiting room, Sarah could see Reynolds through the window. He was holding his wife, both of them looking terrified. Barrett stood nearby, his face showing the same shame she had seen earlier on the street. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed open the door. It was time to show them once again who she really was, not through words or protests, but through the results of her work and the compassion in her heart. The real conversation about what had happened earlier would come later. Right now, she had good news to deliver to anxious parents. The waiting room fell silent as Sarah entered. Officer Reynolds and his wife jumped to their feet, their faces filled with fear and hope. The other officers, including Barrett and Sergeant Miller, stood back respectfully, watching the scene unfold. "Emily made it through the surgery successfully," Sarah announced, her voice gentle but professional. "Her new heart rhythm is strong and steady. She's going to be okay." Mrs. Reynolds burst into tears of relief, collapsing into her husband's arms. Officer Reynolds stood there, his tough police officer exterior completely broken. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at Sarah, seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time. "Dr. Thompson," he started, his voice cracking with emotion. I can't." He struggled to find the right words, overwhelmed by the fact that the woman he had racially profiled and harassed just hours ago had just saved his daughter's life. "Your daughter is strong," Sarah continued, maintaining her professional demeanor. "She fought hard, and the surgery went well. We'll keep her in intensive care for the next 48 hours, but I expect a full recovery." Officer Barrett, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. His eyes were red, and his hands were shaking. "Dr. Thompson, what we did earlier, it was—" He couldn't finish his sentence, the shame clearly visible on his face. Sarah raised her hand to stop him. "This isn't the time or place for that conversation. Right now, Emily needs her parents' full attention." She turned back to the Reynolds family. "Would you like to see her? She's still sleeping. You can sit with her." Mrs. Reynolds, who knew nothing about the earlier confrontation, looked confused at the tension between her husband and her daughter's surgeon. "Tom," she said to her husband, "what's going on? Do you know Dr. Thompson?" Officer Reynolds looked at his wife, then back at Sarah. The shame on his face was painful to watch. "Linda, I did something terrible today, something I can never take back." His voice broke again as he looked at Sarah. "And yet, you saved our Emily." The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, the weight of what had happened earlier that evening hanging heavy in the air. Sergeant Miller stood by the door, watching his officers finally understand the consequences of their prejudices. "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds," Sarah said firmly, "Emily is waiting. Would you like to see her now?" They nodded gratefully, and Sarah led them toward the IQ. As they walked through the quiet hospital corridors, Officer Reynolds kept glancing at Sarah, his face a mix of gratitude, shame, and amazement. Emily lay peaceful in her hospital bed, surrounded by monitoring equipment. Despite the tubes and wires, her color was already better than before the surgery. Mrs. Reynolds rushed to her daughter's side, gently taking her small hand. "The next few hours are crucial," Sarah explained, checking the monitors. "But she's strong, and all her vital signs are good." She made some notes on Emily's chart, then turned to leave the family alone with their daughter. "Dr. Thompson," Officer Reynolds called out softly. When she turned back, he was crying openly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did today, what I assumed about you, I'll have to live with that shame forever. But you saved my little girl anyway. You're a better person than I could ever be." Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Officer Reynolds, this isn't about being better or worse. It's about seeing people for who they really are, not what we assume they are." She glanced at Emily's peaceful face. "Your daughter will need regular checkups. We'll be seeing each other often. Maybe we can both learn something from this." As Sarah walked out of the IQ, she could hear Mrs. Reynolds asking her husband what had happened earlier that day. That was a conversation they needed to have, but it wasn't Sarah's concern anymore. She had done her job, not as a black woman proving herself to prejudiced officers, but as a surgeon saving a life that needed saving. The night shift was just beginning, and somewhere in Boston, another heart might need her help. That's who she was, and no amount of prejudice could change that truth. A week after Emily's surgery, Sarah sat in her office reviewing patient files. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, lighting up the many awards and certificates on her wall. There was a gentle knock on her door. "Come in," she called, looking up from her paperwork. Officer Reynolds entered, looking very different from the aggressive policeman who had stopped her car that night. He was in civilian clothes, holding a small bouquet of flowers. His wife stood beside him, and between them was Emily, looking much stronger than she had a week ago. "Dr. Thompson," Mrs. Reynolds smiled warmly. "Emily wanted to thank you properly." She gently nudged her daughter forward. Emily, still a bit pale but with bright eyes, held out a handmade card. "Thank you for fixing my heart," she said shyly. The card was decorated with glitter and drawings of hearts. Sarah accepted the card with a warm smile. "Thank you, Emily. How are you feeling?" "Much better." Emily grinned. "Daddy says you're a hero. He says you saved me even though he was mean to you." Mrs. Reynolds looked sharply at her husband, who had told her everything about that night. The story had brought her to tears, and she had spent days trying to understand how her husband could have acted that way. "Emily's right," Officer Reynolds said quietly. "You are a hero, Dr. Thompson, not just for saving my daughter, but for how you handled everything." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this past week." Sarah gestured for them to sit down. Emily climbed onto her mother's lap, clutching her favorite teddy bear, the same one her mother had held during the surgery. "I've requested a transfer to community relations," Reynolds continued. "And I'm working with Sergeant Miller to start a new training program at the department. We want to address racial bias in police work. Would you consider coming to speak to our officers?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying the man before her. The change in him was remarkable, not just in his manner, but in his eyes. There was humility there now, and understanding. "Officer Barrett has already signed up to help," he added. "That night changed both of us. We can't undo what we did, but we can try to prevent it from happening to others." Mrs. Reynolds reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. "Tom's been different since that night," she said softly. "He's been talking to Emily about treating everyone with respect, about not judging people by how they look." Emily, playing with her teddy bear, looked up. "Daddy showed me your picture in the hospital magazine. You've saved lots of people, not just me." Sarah smiled at the little girl. "That's my job, Emily. To help people who need help, no matter who they are." "That's what I want to do now too," Reynolds said earnestly. "To help people who need help, without prejudice or assumptions. Will you help us learn to do better?" Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the hospital grounds where people of all backgrounds came seeking help. She thought about all the times she'd been judged, stopped, questioned, not for anything she'd done, but for who she was. "Yes," she finally said, turning back to face them. "I'll help. Not just because of what happened that night, but because change only happens when people are willing to learn from their mistakes." Emily slid off her mother's lap and walked over to Sarah, holding up her teddy bear. "His name is Dr. Bear," she announced. "I decided he's going to be a heart doctor too, just like you." The adults laughed, the tension in the room breaking. Mrs. Reynolds wiped away tears, and even Officer Reynolds managed to smile. "First," Sarah said, kneeling down to Emily's level, "let's check how Dr. Bear's patient is doing." She pretended to listen to Emily's heart with her stethoscope, making the little girl giggle. As she played with Emily, Sarah realized that sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest ways, with one person, one moment, one heart at a time. The night that had started with prejudice and fear had somehow opened a door to understanding and growth. 3 months had passed since that life-changing night. The police training room was packed with officers, all eyes focused on Sarah as she stood at the podium. Officer Reynolds and Barrett sat in the front row, along with Sergeant Miller. "My name is Dr. Sarah Thompson," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Some of you know me as the cardiac surgeon from Memorial Hospital. Others know me from what happened that night on Oak Hill Street. Today, I'm here to talk about both of those parts of my story." The room was silent. Many officers had heard about what happened that night. The story had spread through the department, becoming a powerful lesson about prejudice and redemption. "Last week, I performed surgery on a 5-year-old boy," Sarah continued, clicking to show a photo on the screen behind her. "His father was one of your fellow officers. The week before that, I operated on a grandmother from Roxbury. The week before that, a college student from China." She paused, looking around the room. "When they're on my operating table, I don't see their color, their uniform, or their background. I see human beings who need help. That's the lesson I want to share today." Officer Reynolds stood up, joining her at the podium. He looked different now, humbler, more thoughtful. His community relations badge shone on his civilian clothes. "3 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career," he said to his fellow officers. "I judged Dr. Thompson based on nothing but prejudice. Hours later, she saved my daughter's life without hesitation. That night changed everything for me." In the back of the room, Mrs. Reynolds sat with Emily, who was now fully recovered. Emily waved at Sarah, holding up Dr. Bear, who was wearing a tiny surgeon's coat that Sarah had given him. Barrett spoke next, his voice emotional. "We started making real changes in how we approach our work. In the past 3 months, complaints about racial profiling in our precinct have dropped by 60%, but we have more work to do." Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about racial bias in police stops. "These numbers tell a story," she explained, "but behind each number is a real person, a doctor heading home from surgery, a student going to class, a father picking up his children." The training session continued for 2 hours. Officers asked questions, shared experiences, and discussed ways to overcome unconscious bias. Sarah noticed that the younger officers seemed especially engaged, taking notes and participating actively. After the session, Sergeant Miller approached Sarah with news. "The police commissioner wants to make this training mandatory for all precincts in the city," he said proudly. "Your story is making a real difference." Emily ran up to Sarah, Dr. Bear still in her arms. "Look, Dr. Thompson, I got an A+ on my science project about the heart." She held up a colorful poster covered with drawings of the circulatory system. "That's wonderful, Emily." Sarah smiled, examining the poster. "Maybe we'll have another doctor in the family." Mrs. Reynolds hugged her husband, watching their daughter excitedly explain her project to Sarah. "It's amazing how something so terrible turned into something so positive," she said softly. Officer Reynolds nodded, his eyes moist. "Dr. Thompson didn't just save Emily's life that night. She helped save my soul. She showed me what real integrity looks like." As Sarah packed up her presentation materials, she reflected on the changes of the past 3 months. The night that could have ended in tragedy had instead sparked a movement of positive change within the police department. "Same time next week?" Barrett asked, helping her with her bags. "We have new officers starting, and they need to hear this story." Sarah nodded. "I'll be here. Change happens one person at a time, one story at a time." She looked around the room, now filled with officers talking and reflecting on the session. "We're all learning together." Outside, the sun was setting over Boston. Sarah walked to her car, no longer worried about being stopped or questioned. She had helped create something powerful, not just saving lives in the operating room, but helping to change hearts and minds in ways she never expected. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest miracles happen outside the operating room.